This presentation is about persecution in the early church. Jesus warned his disciples of coming persecution. In the Gospel of John, he said, "If the world hates you, realize that it hated me first." In verse 20, he says, "If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you." And the last of the Beatitudes says, "Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So the church, and not just the early church, has been warned of the possibility of persecution. It didn't take very long for it to happen, for Stephen was martyred probably as early as 34 to 36 AD, along with the persecution of Hellenist Christians. About 11 years later, Herod Agrippa had James, the brother of the Lord, executed. Christianity became not only hated in Jerusalem, but also fell under suspicion by the Romans. They were known to be uncompromising. That is, they would not worship the state gods. And eventually they were blamed for any natural disaster that might befall the empire. Many rumors and innuendos were leveled against Christians, that they were atheists, cannibals, accused of sorcery, haters of humanity, possessing intellectual contradictions in their doctrine, and other charges. The first persecution by the Roman Empire did not happen until 64 AD, after a fire broke out in Rome that destroyed almost all of the districts. Only 4 were undamaged. Nero, the emperor, probably did not cause the fire, but rumor blamed him for it, so, to change that, he placed blame on the Christians and used them as scapegoats. To quote the Roman historian Tacitus, consequently, he says, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the people. He continues, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty, and then upon gathering information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against humanity. During the persecution, Tacitus says that Christians were made sport of. They were killed by dogs, by having the hides of beasts attached to them, or they were nailed to crosses, or set aflame when the daylight passed away. They were used as human nighttime torches. Nero gave his own gardens for this spectacle and performed a circus game in the habit of a charioteer, mixing with the plebeians or driving about the racecourse. Even though they were clearly guilty and merited being made the most recent example of the consequences of crime, people began to pity these sufferers because they were consumed not for the public good, but on account of the fierceness of the one man. And a place where they were lit as torches in the evening is actually where the Vatican Gardens stand today. Clement of Rome, in his first letter to the Corinthians, recounts how many Christian women were martyred by being forced to act out the part of Dirce in the Roman festival of Dirce, during which they were tied to the horns of a wild bull and drugged to their deaths, like Dirce was. During this persecution, both Peter and Paul were martyred, St. Peter by being crucified upside down, and St. Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, by being beheaded. The Greek word for testimony, martyrion, and the Latin word for witness, martys, were used by Christians to refer to those who died for their faith. They were felt to be giving the ultimate witness or testimony for their beliefs. Thus, they were martyrs. Up until that time, Christianity had been growing rather secretly in Rome. It was popular with the slaves and the poor in the low Jewish quarters by the Tiber River, but many spectators had seen Christian witness, and it began to attract some people of higher stature in Roman society. The second Roman persecution against Christians occurred during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, the third and last of the Flavian dynasty, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD. The Roman historian Pliny called Domitian the beast from hell, who sat in its den licking blood. Even the pagans hated Domitian. Although he was one of the best administrators to ever govern Rome, there was certainly something wrong with Domitian. He enjoyed, catching flies and stabbing them with a pen. He liked to watch gladiator fights between women and dwarfs. He was the first emperor to take his divinity seriously, and he had himself officially titled in Rome as God the Lord. He insisted that people hail his greatness with acclamations like Lord of the Earth, Invincible, Glory, Holy, and Thou alone. Domitian did not persecute Christians only, but everyone who had not recognized his divinity, so many Jews were also included in this. Additionally, he banished philosophers from Rome, probably because of the Stoics, who certainly would not accept the state gods. Additionally, he executed at least 12 former consuls. In 95 AD, Domitian had his cousin Flavius Clemens, who was the great-nephew of the Emperor Vespasian, and who also held the office of consul along with Domitian, executed. He also had Clemens' wife Flavia Domitilla exiled. Many historians suspect this was because they were Christians. This act convinced the Senate that no one was safe. And Domitian was indeed murdered on September 18, 96 AD by 2 praetorian prefects, several palace officials, and his own wife, Domitia Longina, the daughter of Nerva, who became emperor immediately after Domitian's death. The sons of Clemens and Domitilla, Titus and Domitian, named after Domitian and his brother Titus, who Domitian had openly named as successors, were Christian, and if the Senate had not been so excited about Domitian's death and declared that no Flavian would succeed Domitian as the next emperor, there indeed would have been a Christian emperor 2 centuries before Constantine. Many scholars say that Domitian's persecution was the background to the writing of the book of Revelation. There seems to be a reference to the Nero Redivivus legend that became popular very soon after Nero's death. The beast with the number in Revelation 13 is thought to have a number that corresponds to the numerical value in the name Caesar Nero. The beast carried the number 666, or, depending on what translation one reads, 616. Nonetheless, persecution aside, by the end of the 1st century, there were approximately 500,000 Christians in the Roman Empire. Persecution, though subsiding with the death of Domitian, nevertheless continued sporadically throughout the 2nd century. 2 years after Domitian, the Roman general Trajan became emperor. Trajan was a skilled ruler whose conquest of Dacia was the last major conquest of Rome. Excited by his victories and wanting to perfect his rule and unify his domain, Trajan decreed that the Christians should unite with their pagan neighbors in the worship of the gods. The penalty for all who refused to offer the sacrifice was death. A series of letters with the governor of Bithynia, Pliny the Younger, reveals his position on Christians. Alarmed at the number of executions he was to impose, Pliny asked Trajan what to do about Christians. Trajan's response was, "Don't ask, don't tell." In other words, do not seek them out, nor pay any attention to accusations that do not seem responsible. Christians were to be dealt with only on accusations that were believable, and even then given the opportunity to recant, to give up their beliefs. If the accused did not do so, well, he was to be executed. Trajan's policy does extend leniency. However, he became the first emperor to persecute Christians as totally separated from Jews, and Christianity did have its status as an illegal religion enhanced from then on. There were some other persecutions during the reign of Trajan. Clement of Rome, according to legend, was tied to an anchor and thrown into the Black Sea. This Clement is considered the 4th bishop of Rome, the Pope, and according to the theologian and writer Tertullian, he was ordained by St. Peter himself. The 3rd bishop of Antioch, Ignatius, Peter being the first, tried to hinder the emperor's plan to have Christians worship the gods. He was arrested and led before Trajan himself, who had journeyed to Antioch. The emperor ordered that he should be chained up and taken to Rome for execution. He was thrown to the beasts in the Colosseum, as this famous painting depicts. On his way to execution, Ignatius wrote 7 letters, including one to a 38-year-old bishop named Polycarp. 2 excerpts from his letter to Polycarp appear on this slide. From his letters, we learn of his difficulties on the journey, and also something about the structure of the church. He encouraged the Christian communities to obey their respective bishop, to avoid heresy, and to adhere to the belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. For his part, Polycarp himself would eventually suffer martyrdom. Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, had been a Christian from childhood. St. Irenaeus tells us that he knew and conversed with many who had seen the Lord. In fact, he had sat at the foot of the Apostle John and was taught by him. He also writes that Polycarp had, in fact, been appointed as Bishop of Smyrna by the apostles. Polycarp was martyred by being burned at the stake on February 23, 156 AD, at the age of 86, under the rule of the Emperor Antoninus Pius, who was emperor from 138 to 161. The governor presiding over the proceedings begged Polycarp to recant. He would not. Polycarp said, "I have followed my Lord for 80 years. He has been nothing but good to me. Why would I abandon him now?" So, they tied him to the stake and set the flames. But the flames did not consume him. Eventually, they had to stab him to death. The 2 adopted sons of Antoninus, Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius, succeeded Antoninus as co-emperors until Verus died in 169 of either food poisoning or, some believe, smallpox. Marcus Aurelius, the last of these so-called 5 good emperors, was a follower of Stoicism and a philosopher in his own right. His writing, Meditations, is the most significant source for our current understanding of Stoicism. Christians were hoping he would extend more of a sympathetic ear to them. But Aurelius despised Christians for not fully supporting the empire, and for not being sensible enough to burn a pinch of incense to the gods and save their own lives. It was during the reign of Marcus Aurelius that St. Justin suffered martyrdom. Justin was an apologist who tried to demonstrate the superiority of the Christian gospel philosophically. After a public debate in which Justin got the best of the philosopher Crescens, an advisor to the emperor and apparently a jerk in his own right, Justin was denounced by Crescens to Marcus Aurelius as a Christian. After giving a defense, Justin was beheaded. This is the remains of the amphitheater in Lugdunum in Roman Gaul, which is modern-day Lyon, France. This persecution was apparently particularly severe. In his writing, The Martyrdom of Prominent Martyrs of Lyon and Vienne, M. Reginald says, "Most of the early Christians living in Lyon and Vienne were Greeks, who had migrated from Asia. It is not known exactly how the persecution started, but one reason may have been a significant one is that the Emperor Marcus Aurelius wanted to relieve the rich landlords of the high expenses involved in hiring professional gladiators who used to fight and kill for their amusement. So he allowed them to buy victims in the form of condemned criminals at 1/10 of the price they actually had to pay for the professional gladiators. So the landlords grabbed the opportunity and pounced on the Christians, because Christians were at that time already being charged with murder, incest, and cannibalism. The elite of society found this a great opportunity to save money and at the same time get rid of the hateful group of people called Christians. This persecution increased in severity. At first, Christians were banned from public baths and in the marketplaces. Then they were excluded from public places, since it was believed that their very presence contaminated and violated the places of the gods. Then, they were hounded and attacked openly, treated as public enemies, assaulted, beaten up, and even stoned. The city officials had them arrested, thrown into prison, where they were allowed to lay in their own filth and excrement. Some died from this. The governor then ordered a public trial of the Christians, and during this trial they were tortured in every possible way. The public, not having any solid charge, brought the non-Christian slaves to the Christian prisoners and tortured them. This was done to make the slaves confess that their masters had indeed indulged in incest, cannibalism, and murder. Some of the slaves, unable to bear the agony and the pain of torture, confessed. But these charges were angrily denied by the Christians. Sanctus, the deacon, refused to give even his name to the torturers. Some of the martyrs actually did that. In Sanctus' case, when there was nothing more that they could do to him, they applied metal plates that were burned until they were red hot, and they applied them to the most tender parts of his body. His body became swollen and inflamed, but he did not yield. For every question they put to him, he had only one answer: I am a Christian. And Pothinus, the Bishop of Lyon, was a very sick person and was over 90 years old. The enraged crowd dragged him to the tribunal. The governor asked him who was the God of Christians. The bishop replied, "If you are worthy, you will know." People kicked him, slapped him, and he endured everything without saying a word. 2 days later, he died. Blandina, a slave girl, was the last to die. She was hung on a stake as food for wild beasts. But the beast did not attack her. So she was taken down from the stake and was tortured. Again, Blandina and a 15-year-old boy named Ponticus were thrown to the beast, but Blandina encouraged Ponticus to be strong. In fact, she was encouraging everyone and incurring the wrath of the crowd. Ponticus endured every kind of torture and expired. Blandina was whipped and made to sit on the red-hot chair. At last she was thrown into a net and cast before a bull, and the bull drug her around the arena until she was unconscious. Finally, they cut her throat. At last, all the bodies of the martyrs were exposed for 6 days, and then they were burnt and their ashes thrown into the Rhone River. For his part, Irenaeus was chosen to go on a serious mission to Rome, and this journey happened to coincide with the outbreak of the persecution in Lyon, so he was not there. He was the bearer of a letter to Pope Eleutherius, urging him to deal firmly with the Montanist faction. At any rate, Irenaeus became the Bishop of Lyon with the death of Pothinus, and ultimately he will suffer martyrdom under Emperor Septimius Severus around the year 203. Septimius Severus became the emperor in 193, having emerged during the year of the 5 emperors. Because of the many problems facing the empire, for the first few years of his reign, he spent his time preoccupied with the civil war he was waging in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. During the early years of the reign of Septimius Severus, the Christians enjoyed comparative peace, and Severus himself showed them considerable favor. Early in the 3rd century, a change set in, and in 202 the emperor issued an edict forbidding conversions to Christianity and to Judaism. The significant thing is, he put his army and police to use. This change in the emperor's attitude, thus published abroad, at once intensified all the elements which are hostile to Christianity. And the popular disfavor, which continued to widespread, was continually venting itself in local persecutions, now allowed freer reign. The result was in Egypt and North Africa, persecutions broke out, which were extremely severe. It was during this time that 2 young women, Perpetua and Felicity, suffered martyrdom. It was in the African city of Carthage, in the year 203, during the persecutions ordered by the Emperor Severus. The 5 catechumens were arrested for their faith. The group consisted of a slave named Revocatus, his fellow slave Felicitas, or Felicity, who was expecting a child, 2 free men, Saturninus and Secundulus, and the young wife of 22, named Vivia Perpetua, the wife of a man in good position and mother of a small infant. Perpetua kept a diary of her experiences and her visions while in prison, and Felicity, a pregnant slave, delivered her baby while in prison so she could be with her friends. Alexander Severus was an open-minded emperor in religious matters, and even wanted to build a temple to the founder of Christianity, Jesus, but he was talked out of it by pagan priests. Maximinus Thrax was the first barbarian to hold the title of emperor, and he was the first emperor to never set foot in Rome. His persecution against the Christians was chiefly centered against the clergy. Decius was the first Roman emperor to die in battle. He tried to restore the glorious days of Rome's past in order to stabilize Rome during the crisis of the 3rd century. His intent was to return Rome to the worship of the state gods to encourage their help during the unstable times. He required everyone throughout the empire to demonstrate their loyalty to the state gods and to his divine reign. So, he required mandatory public sacrifice to the Roman gods. He also continued the policies of Severus, allowing no new conversions. He attempted to totally exterminate Christianity. Bishops and priests were unconditionally executed. Other Christians were given a chance to renounce their Christianity. The requirement for sacrifice was empire-wide. Thus, this became the first general empire-wide persecution of Christians. Upon sacrificing to the gods, one would receive what was called a libellus, that is, a certificate. Many Christians did become apostate, that is, denied their faith, and offered sacrifice to the gods. These were called sacrificati by the Christians, and those who burned incense to the gods were called thurificati. Some faked it. They obtained certificates fraudulently, offering bribes or having someone else get them for them. These were called libellatici. Others who apostatized did so temporarily. They were called lapsi, or the lapsed. But those who endured imprisonment and torture, but who did not die, were known as confessors. Now they are not to be confused with the priests who today hear our confessions and who we call confessors. These confessors were very respected by all Christians and were deeply treasured for what they had endured. The theologian Origen was himself a confessor. He endured torture under the Emperor Decius and survived. But a little while later he became a martyr, dying of his wounds. Thus the martyrdom he desired as a youth finally came to pass in his old age. The persecution of Decius lasted only 2 years, but it had a major impact on the internal affairs of the church. After the persecution, many Christians who renounced Christ wanted to be reinstated into the church. This is a question of what to do with the lapsed. The big question was, should they who were temporary apostates be reinstated? What about the degree of lapsing? For example, some only pretended to deny Christ by obtaining fraudulent certificates, libellatici, and who should have the authority to decide this matter? Should it be bishops or should it be the confessors? The challenge was particularly strong in Carthage, where Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, had been encouraged to flee by his advisors so he could continue to guide his diocese from safety. When he returned, he was accused of being a coward, and the confessors claimed they had the authority to forgive the lapsed Christians or not forgive them, instead of Cyprian the bishop, who fled. But Cyprian insisted that the people had no hope of salvation being separated from the church, and he won the point. The discipline of those returning was agreed to be rigid, and 2 priorities became evident for the church: the purity of the church and the forgiving love of the Lord that the church needed to emulate. The result is the penitential system that begins to develop, ultimately leading to the sacramental penance system we have today. The Emperor Valerian, who ruled from 253 to 260, was taken captive by the Sassanid Persian king Shapur I after the humiliating Battle of Edessa. He was the first Roman emperor to be captured as a prisoner of war. While fighting the Persians, he sent 2 letters to the Senate ordering steps to be taken against Christians. The first, sent in 257, commanded Christian clergy to perform sacrifices to the Roman gods or face banishment. The second, the following year, was ordered against Christian leaders, and they were to be executed. Roman senators and knights where Christians were to perform acts of worship to the Roman gods or lose their titles, their property, and if they continued to refuse, their life. It was also decreed that Roman matrons who would not apostatize would lose their property and be banished. And civil servants and members of the imperial household who would not worship the Roman gods would be reduced to slavery and sent to work on the imperial estates. Now this shows that Christians were prevalent at this time in very high positions. Among the prominent Christians executed as a result of their refusal to perform acts of worship to the Roman gods as ordered by Valerian were Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, who endured martyrdom this time, Pope Sixtus II, Bishop of Rome, along with 6 deacons, and Lawrence of Rome. And during this persecution, Christians began meeting in catacombs, the underground cemeteries of Rome. Valerian's first act as emperor on the 22nd of October 253 was to make his son Gallienus his Caesar and colleague. When Valerian's son Gallienus became emperor in 260, upon Valerian's capture and death, he rescinded the legislation against Christianity. He allowed freedom of worship to Christians and brought Christians into his own government. He restored any property that had been confiscated, and he returned it to the church. Furthermore, he permitted conversions to Christianity. He proclaimed an edict or decree of toleration when his father was taken captive by the Persians. Although the edict did not make Christianity an official religion, this edict did outlive him by 30 years. The Emperor Diocletian adhered to this edict for 16 years. Diocletian was a brilliant strategist, and to stabilize the empire, he divided its administration into east and west in the year 286. He moved its headquarters from Rome to Nicomedia, which is modern Turkey. He created what is called a tetrarchy. The system created 2 Augustus and 2 Caesars in both the east and the west. The idea was to create a smooth transition of power in Roman government, which had been suffering from civil war and instability in leadership. The 2 Caesars were emperors in training and were supposed to take over as Augustus in 20 years. The co-Augustus in the west was a general named Maximian. He ruled from Rome. The dividing line between east and west was from North Africa to what is now Yugoslavia. This division would work. Within 3 years of becoming emperor, Diocletian effectively stabilized the Roman Empire. The Augustus in the west was Maximian, and his Caesar was Constantius Chlorus, a general. The Augustus in the east, of course, was Diocletian, and his Caesar was another general named Galerius. This division impacts the church today, for it created not only an administrative division in the Roman Empire, it also created one in the church. It created an Eastern and Western church, and this division still exists. The Eastern Church and the Eastern Rites, the Western Church and the Western Rite are the Roman Rites. Most all Catholics in the United States and North America belong to the Western Rite, although there are pockets of Eastern Rite Catholics as well. Now Galerius was a pagan, and his mother Romula's intense devotion to certain pagan cults and distrust of the new Christian religion was said to have greatly influenced him. For much of Diocletian's rule, Christians had been allowed to practice their religion, but Galerius urged the aging emperor to launch a renewal of persecutions. After some Christians in attendance at a public sacrifice made the sign of the cross during a ritual sacrifice, it was declared ruined. In an edict dated February 24, 303, Christian scriptures were ordered to be destroyed, as were Christian houses of assembly. Later that year, Diocletian's palace in Nicomedia, at that time the eastern capital of the empire, was engulfed by flames, and harassment of the minority sect, the Christians, intensified as a result. All Christians in this city were ordered to be put to death as punishment. But some scholars suggest that Galerius himself was behind the arson attack as a way to incite further attacks on Christians. Persecution was ironic because some members of Diocletian's household staff were Christians, including one of his favorite slaves who he tortured to death. His own wife and daughter were in all likelihood Christian catechumens. The persecution began by evicting Christians from the army. The Edict of 303 removed Christians from civil positions. The destruction of churches and the burning of scriptures was then ordered. Those who handed scriptures over to be burned were called traditors, or traitors, by the Christians. Eventually, the requirement for all Christians to sacrifice to the gods was imposed, and all Christian leaders were arrested. This became the most severe and widespread persecution under the Roman Empire. In 305, Galerius called upon Diocletian to give up his position as scheduled, and the ill Diocletian did so. Diocletian put pressure on Maximian to step down when he did. The two Caesars then were elevated to Augustus, Constantius Chlorus and Galerius, and Diocletian actually retired to a nice villa where he lived out his remaining days, unlike most of the Roman emperors. Before he abdicated in the West, Maximian had refused to adhere closely to Diocletian's policies. Church property was confiscated here and there, but in the West no one was killed or imprisoned for being Christian. The persecution of Diocletian and Galerius was concentrated then mostly in the East, although it was intended to be empire-wide. The new Augustus in the West was Constantius Chlorus, who was the father of Constantine. In 311, Galerius became ill, and he smelled so badly that no one could stand to be around him, for his body had become infested with worms. Christians convinced him it was God's punishment for persecuting them, and he believed them. In response, Galerius enacted another Edict of Toleration. This edict pardoned Christians and allowed them to pursue their faith and to assemble together. It also required them to pray to their God for the emperor and for the public good. The edict was welcomed by Constantius in the West and by his son Constantine, who had become the Caesar for Constantius. They had family members who were Christian, particularly the biological mother of Constantine. Constantius Chlorus stepped down within a year, and Constantine became emperor of the Western Empire in 306, which he ruled until 324. Civil war ensued in the West when Maxentius, Constantine's own Caesar, challenged him for the throne. The battle was decided on the Milvian Bridge. The night before, Constantine saw a vision of the Chi and Rho. He heard the message in Hoc Signo Vinces. He had this symbol of the Chi Rho painted on his soldiers' shields, and in this sign he conquered. During the course of the battle, Maxentius and his soldiers were retreating across the Milvian Bridge when it collapsed with the weight upon it. He was trapped under the water and drowned. It's difficult to overestimate the importance of Constantine to Christianity. He was the first to use the Chi Rho symbols. He met with the Emperor Licinius, the Eastern Augustus, and together they issued the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity, an illegal religion from the time of Trajan, a legal religion. It was a monumental moment for Christians. In 321, he made Sunday a legal holiday in Rome, which actually had no shortage of holidays. Constantine met with Licinius at Milan and established an alliance which required the cessation of Christian persecution. In 380, the Emperor Theodosius the Great made the Christianity of the Pope in Rome the official state religion. Persecutions ironically contributed to the growth of the Church. They encouraged the thinking of the apologists in early Christian theology and caused deep thinking over controversial issues. Other facts are that persecutions were not constant. It was sporadic, and not all emperors paid as much attention to Christianity as others did. Not all places in the empire experienced persecution to the same degree. Ultimately, Christianity emerges stronger than before.